Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be diving into a story that you might think you know, but I think you're in for some surprises.
Yeah, it's one of those cases that just keeps twisting and turning the more you learn about it.
Exactly. And we're talking about the story of Gypsy Rose Blanchard. If you haven't heard this name, it's one that really captured the world's attention. It really takes you into this dark world of Munchausen by proxy.
Yeah, for anyone who's not familiar, Munchausen by proxy is basically when a caregiver fakes or exaggerates a child's illness for attention and sympathy.
It's really disturbing stuff. And in Gypsy's case, it was her own mother, Dee Dee, who was the mastermind behind this whole facade.
Yeah, and we're going to be exploring that in detail today, drawing from a recent episode of the true crime podcast Surlessly called Gypsy Rose Explosive New Confessions. Very dark allegations.
And we're also going to be listening to Gypsy's own words from an interview she did on the Vile Files podcast.
These two sources together review so much about the manipulation, the abuse, and ultimately the desperate act that landed Gypsy in prison.
Right, and just to kind of set the stage for people, Dee Dee really went to extraordinary lengths to create this image of Gypsy as a terminally ill child.
Oh, absolutely. The Surlessly podcast really dives deep into how Dee Dee would doctor shop. So no single physician ever had the full picture of Gypsy's supposed medical history.
It's so crafty and manipulative, you almost have to admire her cunning in a way.
Yeah, in a twisted way, I guess. But it's truly terrifying to think about how she used medical jargon, fabricated test results, and even, inflicted injuries on Gypsy to keep up this charade.
And keeping Gypsy isolated was a key part of maintaining control, right?
Absolutely. She rarely let Gypsy interact with others without her being right there watching and controlling the narrative.
It's almost like she created this prison of fabricated illnesses, and Gypsy was the captive.
And that constant reinforcement of illness really had a profound impact on Gypsy's psyche.
Can you imagine being told your whole life that you can't walk, you can't eat solid food, you can't live a normal life?
It's heartbreaking, and the Vile Files podcast actually shares some details about how Gypsy internalized these limitations. Even when she was away from her mother, she'd still use a wheelchair because that's all she knew. That's the power of that kind of psychological conditioning.
It really speaks to the insidious nature of Munchausen by proxy. It's not just the physical abuse, it's this complete warping of a child's reality.
Yeah, it's about taking away their sense of self, their agency. It's just devastating.
And it's even more shocking when you consider that there are times when Gypsy was observed walking and eating normally when Dee Dee wasn't around.
Oh, yeah. The podcast mentions family members who saw her jumping on a trampoline. It's like she was living this double life, forced to play the sick role only when her mother was present.
Talk about manipulative. It's like Dee Dee created this world where questioning Gypsy's illnesses was equivalent to questioning a mother's love.
Exactly. She really played on people's emotions and trust.
And then on top of all of that, we have these bombshell allegations of sexual abuse by Gypsy's grandfather. That really adds a whole other layer of darkness to this story.
Yeah, that was a major revelation in the Surlessly podcast. And in the Lifetime documentary about this case, the grandfather not only denies the allegations, but actually suggests that 4-year-old Gypsy was trying to touch him inappropriately.
It's just sickening to even think about it. It makes you wonder what other horrors might have been hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect mother-daughter relationship.
Absolutely. It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about the family dynamics.
And yet this one doctor actually suspected that Gypsy might have been kidnapped. That's how convincing Dee Dee was.
It's a testament to how easily abusers can manipulate systems that are meant to protect the vulnerable. Dee Dee was able to fool medical professionals, law enforcement, even some family members for years.
So how did this go unnoticed for so long? Why didn't anyone see through Dee Dee's facade?
Well, Dee Dee was incredibly skilled at isolating Gypsy, making it hard for anyone to get close enough to question what was going on. They also moved frequently, making it difficult for authorities to track them down.
So we have this young woman trapped in a world of fabricated illnesses, facing this unimaginable abuse and just longing for a normal life.
And that longing for freedom ultimately led her to take drastic measures, which is where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned, because this story is about to get even more intense. It's hard to believe that the same girl who was portrayed as helpless and dependent is now out in the world living a relatively normal life.
It's almost surreal, isn't it? Like she stepped out of this manufactured reality and into the spotlight.
Exactly. And the Surlessly podcast really captures the media frenzy that surrounded Gypsy's release from prison. It was like everyone was captivated by this story.
Yeah, she gained millions of followers on social media practically overnight. People were fascinated by every little detail of her new life, her first trip to McDonald's, her new haircut, everything.
It was such a stark contrast to the life of isolation that she had been living. It's like she finally had a voice and a platform to share her story.
And she really embraced that. In the Vial Files interview, she's so open and honest about her experiences and her desire to move forward.
One of the things that surprised me the most was her marriage to Ryan Anderson. It seems like she's really found someone who understands her past and supports her.
Yeah, she talks about how crucial open communication is in their relationship. It's like she's breaking free from all the secrets and manipulation that defined her childhood.
She even talks about wanting to have children someday, but raising them with honesty and openness, which is something she never experienced.
Right. It's like she's determined to create a completely different life for herself and her future family.
But it's not all sunshine and roses.
Yeah.
She also opens up about the lasting trauma from her past. The nightmares, the anxiety, the difficulty adjusting to a world that feels so new to her.
That's an important point. Even though she's physically free from Dee Dee's control, the psychological scars are still there. It highlights the long-term impact of this kind of abuse.
It's not something you just snap out of. And then there's the whole situation with Gypsy and Ryan having to leave Kansas City earlier than planned because of parole restrictions.
Oh, yeah, that was a curveball. Apparently, her Missouri parole officer wasn't comfortable with her being in the state, even though her Louisiana officer had given the okay.
It's a reminder that Gypsy's freedom still comes with limitations, and that she's constantly navigating the consequences of her past actions.
It also brings us back to that central question, where do we draw the line between empathy and accountability?
Right. It's easy to feel sympathy for Gypsy, given everything she went through. But we can't forget that she was involved in a premeditated murder.
The Surlessly podcast really captures this divide in public opinion. Some people applaud Gypsy's newfound freedom and see her as a survivor, while others believe she's a manipulator who deserves a harsher sentence.
It's a moral dilemma with no easy answers.
Mm.
And Gypsy herself even grapples with this complexity. In the Vial Files interview, she says, "I don't associate myself as a murderer. I'm an accessory."
But the fact remains that she played a role in orchestrating her mother's death. It's a situation that really challenges our notions of justice and what it means to be a victim.
And then to add another layer to all of this, we have the revelation that Gypsy actually attempted to kill her mother back in 2011.
Oh, yeah, that detail came out in both the documentary and the Vial Files podcast.
Yeah.
It definitely adds a whole new dimension to the story.
She claims she didn't realize she was firing a BB gun at the time, but it still raises questions about her intentions and her desire to break free from her mother's control.
It makes it even harder to categorize her as simply a victim or a perpetrator.
It's like this case is constantly shifting the more you learn about it.
It definitely keeps you on your toes. And I think that's what makes it so fascinating, but also so tragic.
Yeah, it's a story that really gets under your skin. And, you know, even the host of the Surlessly podcast admits to feeling conflicted about it.
Yeah, I think that's a common reaction. You have this immense sympathy for Gypsy because of the abuse she endured. But at the same time, there's this question of how much agency she really had in her own actions.
Right. It's not like she was a passive bystander in all of this.
Yeah.
She made choices that had serious consequences.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that makes this case so compelling. It forces us to really confront these uncomfortable questions about culpability and manipulation and the limits of empathy.
And of course, we can't forget about Nick Godejohn, Gypsy's former boyfriend, who's currently serving a life sentence for actually carrying out the murder.
Right. He was convicted largely based on Gypsy's testimony, but now she's publicly stating that she manipulated him into doing it.
It's just crazy how this story keeps twisting and turning.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if we'll ever really know the full truth.
Yeah, it's a tangled web, for sure. And it raises some serious questions about coercion and accountability within the criminal justice system.
This whole case is like an onion. The more you peel back the layers, the more complicated it gets.
And I think that's what makes it so important to talk about. It's not just about one woman's tragic story. It's a reflection of larger societal issues.
It really forces us to examine our own biases and assumptions about victims and perpetrators.
Yeah, and it reminds us that these categories aren't always so clear-cut.
So looking back at all of this, what do you think is the most important takeaway from this deep dive? What really sticks with you?
For me, it's Gypsy's resilience. Despite everything she's been through, she's rebuilding her life. She's found love. She's focusing on therapy. She even talks about wanting to have a family someday. It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the capacity for hope, even in the face of unimaginable trauma.
It's really quite remarkable. And it makes you wonder about Dee Dee. What drove her to create this elaborate web of lies? What were her motivations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? While we can't condone her actions, I think it's important to try to understand the underlying psychology of Munchausen by proxy. Maybe by understanding the motivations of abusers, we can learn to identify warning signs earlier and intervene before things escalate to this level.
It's a reminder that even the most shocking and sensational cases often have hidden complexities and deeper stories waiting to be explored.
Exactly. And this deep dive has really just scratched the surface of this incredibly complex and multi-layered case.
We encourage you to check out the source material we mentioned, the Surlessly and Vile Files podcasts, and delve deeper into this story for yourselves.
And as always, we hope this deep dive has inspired you to think critically about the world around you, to question assumptions, and to approach every story with a sense of curiosity and compassion.
Because sometimes the most difficult stories to hear are the ones that teach us the most valuable lessons.
Well said. And that's a wrap on another episode of The Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next exploration into the complexities of the human experience. We'll see you next time.